What would you do if your devotion to someone you love was repaid with betrayal so chilling it destroyed your life? And what if the person you trusted most set you up for a crime so heinous it left you locked behind bars while they moved on to a new life? This is the story of a Texas pastor whose unwavering faith in his wife was shattered when she framed him for murder to pursue a life with her secret lover, a plan so sinister it shook everyone who learned the truth. Before we dive into this gripping tale, ask yourself, how far would you go to uncover the truth if your life was on the line? Subscribe now for more true crime narratives that challenge everything you think you know about loyalty, betrayal, and justice. Pastor Jethro Caldwell was a man of unshakable faith, deeply respected in his Texas community. In his early 40s, Jethro carried the weight of leadership with a quiet confidence, preaching sermons that resonated with hope and redemption. His dark brown eyes were often filled with a mix of wisdom and compassion, and his booming voice commanded attention in any room. Behind his public persona, Jethro was a devoted husband, married to a woman he had loved since their college days. Henrietta Caldwell. Henrietta, or Henny, as her close friends called her, was a striking woman in her late 30s. With rich mahogany skin, sharp cheekbones, and a smile that once lit up Jethro's world, she was the picture of grace and elegance. Henny was not just a pastor's wife, but a woman of intellect and charm, known for her ability to host community events with a warmth that drew people in. However, in recent years, something had changed. The spark in her eyes had dimmed, and her once constant presence at church functions became sporadic. The community whispered, but no one dared to voice their suspicions openly. The Caldwells lived in a modest but inviting brick home on the outskirts of a small Texas town. The house, with its neatly trimmed lawn and a wooden porch swing, reflected Jethro's simplicity and dedication to family. Yet within those walls, cracks in their seemingly perfect life were beginning to show. Jethro's days were consumed by his ministry, whether visiting the sick, mentoring troubled teens, or delivering impassioned sermons. He poured every ounce of himself into his work. He believed in second chances and was known for his ability to guide even the most lost souls back to the light. What he didn't realize was that his own wife was quietly slipping into darkness. Henrietta Caldwell had always been seen as a pillar of the community, but behind her poised exterior, a storm was brewing. Over the years, Henny had started to feel trapped in the expectations of being a pastor's wife, of maintaining an image of perfection that no longer reflected who she was. The spark that had once fueled her faith and her marriage to Jethro was now a faint ember, buried under years of routine and responsibility. Her transformation began gradually, almost imperceptibly. At first, it was small things. She stopped singing hymns during services, claiming her voice was tired. She began skipping midweek church meetings, excusing herself with headaches or errands. Jethro, ever the optimist, dismissed these changes as temporary, chalking them up to fatigue from managing her many commitments. But Henny's withdrawal went deeper. She began spending more time on her phone, scrolling through social media and joining online groups, where she felt less judged, less confined. It was in one of these spaces that she first encountered Lenore Grayson. Lenore's profile was bold, unapologetic. She posted about living life on her own terms, about overcoming adversity, and about finding freedom in being true to oneself. For Henny, it was intoxicating. Lenore was everything she wasn't, fearless, rebellious, and unbound by societal expectations. Their online exchanges began innocently enough. Comments on posts, private messages about shared interests. But as the weeks turned into months, their conversations grew deeper, more personal. Henny confided in Lenore about her struggles, how she felt disconnected from her husband, how the weight of being Pastor Caldwell's wife had become unbearable. Lenore listened, offering validation and encouragement. "You deserve to be happy," she told Henny. "You can't live your life for someone else." For Henny, Lenore became a lifeline. The more they talked, the more she questioned everything about her life. She began to see Jethro not as a devoted husband, but as a symbol of the life she wanted to escape. His unwavering faith, which once inspired her, now felt like a cage. And as her connection with Lenore deepened, Henny's feelings toward her shifted. What started as admiration turned into something more, a longing she couldn't ignore. Around this time, Henny's behavior at home became increasingly erratic. She grew distant, her once affectionate gestures toward Jethro replaced by indifference. She avoided his touch, claiming she was too tired or preoccupied. When he tried to talk to her, she deflected, turning the focus back on his ministry. "You're always so busy with the church," she would say. "Maybe you should focus on that." Jethro, ever patient, refused to give up on his wife. He doubled down on his prayers, asking God to reignite her passion and heal whatever was troubling her. He tried to spend more time with her, suggesting date nights and quiet evenings at home. But no matter what he did, Henny remained elusive. Unbeknownst to Jethro, Henny's growing connection with Lenore wasn't just emotional, it was becoming romantic. Their conversations turned flirtatious, filled with promises of a life free from the constraints of her current world. Lenore, who had a history of manipulation, began planting seeds of doubt in Henny's mind. "Why stay in a life that doesn't make you happy?" she asked. "You have the power to change it." Henny was torn. On one hand, she felt a pang of guilt for betraying the man who had stood by her through everything. On the other, the prospect of a new life with Lenore was irresistible. She began to fantasize about leaving, about starting over in a place where she could be free to love and live on her own terms. But to make that fantasy a reality, she knew she would have to make a difficult choice. And as Lenore's influence grew, Henny began to see Jethro not as her husband, but as an obstacle, one she would need to remove to reclaim her freedom. Jethro Caldwell was a man of unwavering faith, and his belief in the sanctity of marriage was no exception. Though he had noticed Henrietta's growing distance, he refused to believe it was anything more than a temporary phase. He convinced himself that with patience, prayer, and love, they could overcome whatever was troubling her. After all, wasn't that what their vows were about? Standing by each other through better or worse. Every morning before sunrise, Jethro would kneel at the edge of their bed, praying fervently for his wife. He prayed for clarity, for her struggles to ease and for their bond to be restored. "Lord," he whispered one morning, "please show me how to bring her back to you and to us." His devotion was relentless, even as Henny's coldness became more apparent. Determined to reignite the spark in their marriage, Jethro began making changes. He reduced his time at the church, delegating more responsibilities to his assistant pastor, and focused on spending evenings with Henny. He planned date nights, simple yet thoughtful gestures like cooking her favorite meals or taking her to the places they used to frequent during their courtship. Each effort was met with lukewarm responses, her smiles fleeting, and her eyes distant. One Sunday, after a particularly impassioned sermon about forgiveness and renewal, Jethro approached Henny with an idea. "Let's go on a retreat together," he suggested. "Just the two of us. We could use some time to reconnect." Henny hesitated but ultimately agreed, not wanting to raise suspicion. Jethro took it as a sign of hope, unaware that her compliance was driven by guilt rather than genuine interest. The retreat, held at a quiet lodge a few hours away, was meant to be a turning point. Jethro poured his heart into every moment, sharing his dreams for their future and recounting fond memories from their early years together. But while he spoke of hope and healing, Henny's mind wandered to her private phone conversations with Lenore. She had become an expert at masking her true emotions, nodding and smiling at Jethro's words while silently counting the days until she could leave him for good. Despite her detachment, Jethro refused to give up. he sought counsel from elders in the church, asking for advice on how to support a spouse in spiritual crisis. He even suggested they try couples counseling, a progressive step for a man of his traditional values. "I just want us to be happy again," he told her one evening, his voice heavy with sincerity. But Henny's heart had already drifted too far. To her, Jethro's efforts felt suffocating, a reminder of the life she was desperate to escape. Each prayer he offered, each gesture of love, only deepened her resolve to leave. And as she watched him fight for their marriage, she began to see him not as a partner, but as an obstacle standing between her and the life she craved with Lenore. While Jethro was praying for their marriage to heal, Henrietta was being drawn deeper into the orbit of Lenore Grayson. Lenore was no stranger to manipulation, and her charm had an almost magnetic pull on Henny. Their late-night phone calls and video chats became the highlight of Henny's days. Lenore painted a picture of a life filled with freedom, passion, and excitement. A life far removed from the quiet, predictable existence she shared with Jethro. "Why should you have to settle for a life you don't love?" Lenore asked one evening during a particularly candid conversation. "You deserve to be happy, Henny, to be with someone who truly understands you." Henny hesitated. "But Jethro's a good man. He doesn't deserve to be hurt." Lenore's voice softened, dripping with false empathy. "I'm not saying you hurt him, but sometimes to be free, you have to let go of what's holding you back. Isn't your happiness worth it?" It was during one of these conversations that Lenore planted the seed of a dangerous idea. "What if he wasn't in the picture anymore?" she asked, her tone casual yet deliberate. Henny was taken aback, but Lenore quickly backpedaled. "I'm just saying, hypothetically, if he were out of the way, you could start fresh. Think about it." The suggestion lingered in Henny's mind long after the call ended. At first, she dismissed it as a fleeting thought, too outrageous to consider. But as her discontent with her marriage grew, so did her willingness to entertain Lenore's idea. Over time, the hypothetical turned into a plan that was as cruel as it was calculated. It began with a chance encounter. On a routine trip to the market, Henny had an altercation with a taxi driver. The man, who appeared disheveled and mentally unwell, had snapped at her over a misunderstanding about the fare. Henny, already on edge, lashed out at him, but the incident stuck with her. Later that evening, she mentioned the encounter to Jethro, who immediately took action. "Maybe he needs guidance," Jethro suggested. "I'll reach out to the police and see if they can help." Henny filed the incident away in her mind. Weeks later, when the plan to frame Jethro began to take shape, she remembered the driver. He was the perfect scapegoat, disconnected, vulnerable, and already on the police's radar. Under the guise of wanting to help the man, Henny convinced Jethro to invite him to their home. "We could counsel him," she suggested sweetly. "Show him some kindness. Maybe it's what he needs to turn his life around." Jethro, ever the optimist, agreed. He even went the extra mile, baking a chocolate cake for the man as a gesture of goodwill. Henny insisted on the flavor, knowing Jethro disliked chocolate and wouldn't partake. That night, while Jethro was asleep, Henny executed the next phase of her plan. Using syringes she had purchased online, she injected lethal doses of poison into the cake. She then hid the syringes in Jethro's office drawer, ensuring they would be found later. The next morning, Henny made a show of being thoughtful and excited about their visitor. "I'll head out to pick up a few more gifts for him," she said cheerfully, leaving Jethro alone with the man. When the taxi driver arrived, Jethro welcomed him warmly, offering him a slice of cake and engaging him in conversation. Within minutes, the man began to show signs of distress. Clutching his stomach, he collapsed onto the floor, convulsing violently. Jethro, horrified, called 911 and attempted to help, but it was too late. The man died before paramedics arrived. When the police began their investigation, the evidence seemed damning. The syringes in Jethro's office, the poisoned cake he had prepared, and Henny's conspicuous absence during the incident all pointed to him as the perpetrator. Despite his protests of innocence, Jethro was arrested and charged with murder. Henny played the role of the devastated wife flawlessly, shedding tears for the cameras and maintaining her husband's innocence in public. But behind closed doors, she was packing her bags. The moment Jethro was convicted, she left Texas and moved to another state to start her new life with Lenore. For a time, it seemed as though Henny's plan had worked perfectly. She was free, Jethro was behind bars, and her life with Lenore was everything she had imagined, until cracks in their facade began to form. For a few fleeting weeks, Henrietta Caldwell basked in her newfound freedom. With Jethro convicted and out of the picture, she felt liberated, finally able to embrace the life she had dreamed of with Lenore Grayson. The two women moved into a modest but cozy apartment in a bustling city, far from the small Texas town where the crime had unfolded. To outsiders, they appeared as a happy, loving couple, but the reality beneath the surface was far more sinister. Lenore, who had promised Henrietta a life of passion and adventure, began to reveal a darker side. Her controlling tendencies became evident as she dictated Henrietta's every move, from what she wore to who she could speak to. Henny, who had believed she was escaping a life of confinement, found herself in yet another prison, albeit of a different kind. Meanwhile, back in Texas, the fallout from the taxi driver's death continued to ripple through the community. Jethro's arrest had sent shockwaves through his congregation. Many refused to believe that the kind-hearted pastor they had known for years was capable of such a heinous crime. But the evidence presented during his trial, particularly the syringes found in his office drawer, painted a damning picture. Despite Jethro's pleas of innocence and his spotless record, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Jethro, prison was a waking nightmare. The man who had dedicated his life to helping others now found himself surrounded by hardened criminals. Yet even behind bars, he clung to his faith. He prayed daily, not for his own release, but for the truth to come to light. God, reveal what is hidden, he whispered each night, his voice heavy with emotion. His unwavering faith and calm demeanor earned him respect among inmates, but it did little to ease the burden of his wrongful conviction. Back in her new life, Henny tried to convince herself that she had made the right choice. But the cracks in her relationship with Lenore grew deeper. Lenore's volatile temper flared frequently, and her past brushes with the law resurfaced in troubling ways. One evening, during an argument, Lenore let slip a chilling detail. She had once been under investigation for a violent altercation with her ex-lover. The revelation shook Henny, who began to see the parallels between Lenore's previous relationship and their own. The turning point came when Lenore began using Henny's past against her. She would taunt her during arguments, saying things like, "You think you're innocent in all this? You're the one who came to me with the idea to get rid of him." The words cut deep, forcing Henny to confront the weight of her actions. She had destroyed a man's life to chase a dream that was quickly turning into a nightmare. As Henny's guilt grew, so did her paranoia. She became obsessed with the idea that someone might discover the truth. Each knock on the door made her heart race, and every time Lenore left the apartment, she feared she might never return. Her once carefully constructed facade was crumbling under the weight of her lies. The unraveling began when a local journalist, Delilah Warner, started digging into Jethro's case. Delilah had been covering crime stories for over a decade, and something about Jethro's conviction didn't sit right with her. "It's too clean," she told her editor. "This man has no history of violence, no motive. And what kind of killer leaves the murder weapon in his own office drawer?" Delilah's investigation led her to the taxi driver's family, who shared details about his struggles with mental illness and the strange circumstances surrounding his death. She also interviewed members of Jethro's congregation, many of whom described him as a man of unwavering integrity. One parishioner mentioned seeing Henny acting unusually distant in the months leading up to the crime, a detail that piqued Delilah's interest. The breakthrough came when Delilah obtained security footage from a local hardware store showing Henny purchasing syringes just weeks before the murder. Coupled with receipts for the syringes and records of her abrupt move out of state, the evidence painted a very different picture of what had happened. Delilah's exposé, published in a prominent newspaper, reignited public interest in the case. The article raised questions about Henny's involvement and cast doubt on Jethro's guilt. Within weeks, the Texas Innocence Project took up Jethro's case, filing an appeal based on the newly uncovered evidence. For Henny, the walls were closing in. Lenore, sensing the growing scrutiny, became increasingly paranoid. Their arguments turned violent, with Lenore accusing Henny of betraying her. "If I go down, you're coming with me," Lenore warned one night, her voice laced with venom. The idyllic life Henny had envisioned was now a distant memory, replaced by a constant state of fear and regret. And as the truth began to emerge, it became clear that her sins were catching up to her. Meanwhile, the fallout from journalist Delilah Warner's exposé was creating ripples far beyond Texas. Delilah's continued investigation uncovered additional inconsistencies in the case, including the questionable evidence planted in Jethro's office drawer and the timeline of events leading up to the murder. It became increasingly clear that someone else had orchestrated the crime. For Henny, the pressure was unbearable. She became reclusive, refusing to leave the apartment except for necessities. The walls seemed to close in around her, each creak and shadow a reminder of the lies she had built her new life upon. Lenore, ever perceptive, noticed the change in Henny's demeanor. "You're acting strange," she remarked one evening. "If there's something you're hiding, I'll find out." The turning point came when Delilah tracked down Lenore's ex-lover, who revealed chilling details about Lenore's past. "She's dangerous," the woman warned. "She'll do whatever it takes to get what she wants, and she won't hesitate to throw someone under the bus if it suits her." The interview painted a damning picture of Lenore, raising questions about her role in the crime. Back in their apartment, Henny and Lenore's relationship reached a breaking point. Lenore's paranoia escalated as news of Jethro's release spread. "They're coming for us," she hissed one night. "You better not say a word, Henny. If I go down, you're going with me." But Henny's guilt had grown too heavy to bear. The life she had destroyed, the innocent man she had betrayed, it all haunted her. In a moment of desperation, she made a decision that would change everything. She contacted Delilah Warner and confessed. The confession was explosive. Henny detailed everything: the plan to frame Jethro, Lenore's role in influencing her, and the web of lies they had spun. In exchange for her cooperation, Henny was offered a plea deal that would reduce her sentence if she testified against Lenore. Henny's testimony was both riveting and heartbreaking, painting a picture of a woman manipulated into committing unspeakable acts. Lenore, for her part, maintained her innocence, accusing Henny of fabricating the story to save herself. But the evidence was damning, and the jury returned a swift guilty verdict. The trial of Henrietta Caldwell and Lenore Grayson began. The narrative had everything: betrayal, murder, and a love affair turned deadly. It was a story that captivated everyone who heard it. Henrietta, dressed in a modest black dress, sat silently as the prosecution laid out its case. The once poised woman now appeared fragile, her face pale and drawn. Her attorney framed her as a woman swept up in circumstances beyond her control, a victim of manipulation by the cunning and dangerous Lenore Grayson. Henrietta Caldwell's actions were reprehensible, her lawyer admitted in the opening statement, but they were not entirely her own. She was under the influence of a master manipulator. The prosecution, however, painted a starkly different picture. They portrayed Henny as a willing participant who had allowed her greed and selfish desires to overshadow her morality. Prosecutor Benjamin Hargrove delivered a scathing narrative of how Henny had plotted the murder of an innocent man, framed her husband, and abandoned him to pursue her illicit affair. This was no act of desperation, Hargrove argued. It was cold, calculated, and utterly devoid of compassion. The jury listened intently as witness after witness testified. Delilah Warner, the journalist whose investigative reporting had cracked the case, was called to the stand. Her testimony was methodical and damning, recounting the evidence she had uncovered, the surveillance footage, the receipts, and the interviews that exposed Henny and Lenore's schemes. It was clear to me, Delilah said, that this was a premeditated act designed to destroy an innocent man's life. Henny's testimony, however, was the most gripping moment of the trial. She recounted her descent into darkness, describing how Lenore had preyed on her vulnerabilities and promised her a life of freedom and fulfillment. "I thought I was escaping," Henny said, her voice trembling. "But all I did was trade one prison for another." She broke down as she described the moment she decided to poison the cake, tears streaming down her face as she confessed to planting the syringes in Jethro's office. "I didn't want to do it," she sobbed, "but I felt like I had no choice." Lenore, seated at the defense table, watched Henny's testimony with a steely gaze. When it was her turn to take the stand, she denied all accusations, claiming Henny was lying to save herself. "I had nothing to do with this," Lenore insisted. "She's the one who came to me with the plan. She's trying to make me the scapegoat." But her defiance did little to sway the jury. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and her cold demeanor only served to alienate her further. The trial also brought to light new revelations about Lenore's past. Testimonies from her ex-lover and former acquaintances painted a picture of a woman who was manipulative, violent, and willing to do whatever it took to get what she wanted. The jury learned of her previous assault charge, her history of volatile relationships, and her role in influencing Henny to commit murder. "She is a predator," Hargrove told the jury in his closing argument, and Henrietta Caldwell was her prey. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned their verdicts. Lenore Grayson was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Henny, having cooperated with authorities and testified against Lenore, was convicted of second-degree murder and received a 15-year sentence with the possibility of parole after 10. The Texas Innocence Project successfully petitioned for Jethro's conviction to be overturned. The court ruled that Jethro had been wrongfully convicted, and he was released after nearly 2 years behind bars. Jethro's release was met with a mixture of joy and outrage. Supporters rallied behind him, while critics demanded justice for the man's wrongful imprisonment. Jethro, for his part, emerged from prison with his faith intact, but his heart heavy. "I never stopped believing that the truth would come out," he said, "but it doesn't erase the pain of what's been lost." For Jethro, the verdicts brought a bittersweet sense of justice. He attended every day of the trial, sitting silently in the gallery as his wife and her lover's crimes were laid bare. When the sentences were read, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders, but the scars of his ordeal remained. "I forgive them," he said in a statement to the press. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. What they did changed my life forever." The trial's conclusion marked the end of a dark chapter for Jethro and the beginning of a long road to rebuilding his life. He returned to his ministry, using his experience to counsel others who had been wronged. "God has a plan," he told his congregation during his first sermon after his release. "Even in our darkest moments, He is with us." Henny's relationship with her children was another casualty of her actions. Jethro, who had full custody, chose to shield them from the details of their mother's crimes. They knew only that she was away, a vague explanation that would eventually give way to the harsh truth as they grew older. Henny's attempts to maintain a connection with them through letters and occasional supervised calls were met with mixed reactions, her oldest child being the most reluctant to engage. Lenore Grayson's life sentence was met with little sympathy. Her cold, defiant demeanor during the trial had alienated even those who might have otherwise empathized with her. In prison, her manipulative tendencies surfaced again, earning her a reputation as someone best avoided. Unlike Henny, Lenore showed no interest in rehabilitation, choosing instead to maintain her innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against her. The legacy of the case was one of both caution and hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the truth has the power to set people free. And now, we turn the question to you. How far would you go to protect the truth, even if it meant losing everything? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story gripped you, make sure to subscribe to True Crimes Corner for more shocking tales that challenge your sense of justice and morality. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.